The first sound wasn't her scream. It was the splash. Cold water crashed against her face, stealing her breath and sending it back in ragged gasps. She clutched at the splintered edge of the wooden trough, knuckles white and raw, desperate for something solid to hold. The sun above the Texas plains burned without mercy, turning the sky into a harsh, blinding white, and baking the dirt beneath her feet. Her dress was ruined, torn to rags and plastered against her back with sweat, blood, and dust. Bruises marbled her arms and legs, dark and swollen, and tiny cuts stung with every movement. Flies hovered, bold and buzzing, drawn by the smell of sweat and blood. They didn't care about her struggle. Neither did the wind, which carried a dry heat that pressed against her lungs. Behind her, Elias McCrae stood. 52 years old, shoulders broad but stooped from years of labor under an unforgiving sun. His skin was tanned and cracked like leather left out to dry. Sweat soaked his shirt, but it wasn't just the heat that weighed on him. Something heavier rested in his chest, guilt. He wasn't her father. He wasn't her husband. He wasn't even a friend. Yet here she was, half dead, trembling on his land, and the world around them didn't care. "Hold on," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. She tried. Her arms shook violently, her lips blue from lack of air. Water rippled in the trough with her shallow breaths. She had been discovered at sunrise, lying near the fence line, barefoot, beaten, left for dead. People in the town whispered about her. Some called her a runaway. Others said she was cursed. No one wanted to know the truth. Elias didn't care about gossip. He only knew what he saw. Eyes empty of hope, staring at a sky that didn't care. Eyes that spoke of horrors no human should endure. He poured water slowly over her shoulders, letting it run down her arms, washing away the worst of the blood. The sound was soft, almost gentle. She shivered at the touch, but her fingers clutched the wood of the trough like she was holding on to life itself. The plains stretched out before them, endless and harsh. Not a soul came near. No neighbor, no passerby. Fear kept them away. Fear, and maybe shame. Elias looked toward the horizon. The road to Moiti wound lazily across the plains, dust rising in faint, distant clouds. He knew the kind of men who had done this. Boots polished with fear, laughter sharpened by cruelty. Men who enjoyed the sound of a woman's scream as if it were a game. If she survived, they would come back. Her lips moved, forming words he barely heard. "Why, me?" He didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he dipped the cloth into the trough, pressing it gently to her face. She winced but did not pull away. Her eyes met his, wide with terror but holding something else, something defiant. A question. Clara. That was her name. She was 25, a stranger whose existence no one had marked until now. Yet Elias saw beneath the bruises, beneath the dirt, something that refused to die. The sun climbed higher. Its gold light struck the plains, turning the dust into a glittering haze. Her breathing began to steady. The water in the trough turned red, then clear again, 3 times that day as he washed her wounds. 3 times a day. He cleaned her wounds, washed the blood, kept her alive. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't trained. He was just a man who had seen enough death and destruction to know that letting someone die without a fight left a mark on the soul. By the second day, she whispered her name for the first time. Clara. Her voice was weak, trembling, almost swallowed by the wind. The fever still gripped her, but her will to survive burned brighter. Elias sat beside her, hands steady, heart racing, watching for every shallow breath, every flicker of color in her pale face. He fed her water slowly, a tin cup at a time. She drank with a desperation that made him ache. She hadn't known kindness in years, if ever. The day stretched on, the sun relentless. He poured water, washed her face, pressed cloths to her skin. He spoke softly, words meant to soothe, not question. Words that were empty sometimes, and powerful other times. "You're safe here," he said, though he knew the word was fragile. Safe had a way of vanishing in Texas just as quickly as it arrived. Clara didn't answer. She only blinked slowly, eyes tracing the pattern of sunlight across the rough cabin floor. The wind rattled the barn doors. Horses shifted in their stalls. Coyotes howled from distant hills. But Elias didn't care. He only cared that she was still alive. By evening, he made her a simple broth from cornmeal and salt pork. It was little, but she ate. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, the first sign of trust. She looked at him with tired eyes, searching for a reason to believe that someone could care for her without expectation. The night came, and with it, the silence of the plains. Clara lay near the fire, hands gripping the blanket, green eyes flicking toward him every so often. She was still wary. She had survived fear for so long that hope felt foreign. Elias stirred the embers, adding a log here, adjusting a spark there. He pretended not to notice her watching, though he did. Every small movement was a silent promise. Every touch of warmth, a reminder that she had not yet been abandoned. At last, she whispered into the night. "They'll come for me when the moon turns full." Elias froze. He knew exactly what kind of men she meant. Men who would not rest until they reclaimed what they believed they owned. Weeks stretched onward. She gained strength slowly. Her voice grew, though the fear in her eyes never fully lifted. Each sunrise brought a little more life, a little more courage, but the shadow of what had been done to her lingered. By the third morning, the fever had broken. She woke before sunrise, sitting by the window, wrapped in the blanket, staring at the open land as if trying to memorize it in case it disappeared. Elias poured her coffee, black and strong, just the way he drank it. She sipped, winced, then smiled faintly, the first real smile he'd seen. "You said they'd come for you," he reminded her gently. "Who are they?" She didn't look at him. "Men from Moiti. The kind that don't take no for an answer." Elias clenched his jaw. He had known men like that all his life. Men whose Sunday suits had boots soaked in blood. By noon, he saddled his horse. "Stay inside," he warned. "Lock the door." Clara grabbed his sleeve, weak but determined. "You'll get yourself killed." "I know," he said. "But I won't let them take you." The plains stretched endlessly in front of him. Every mile toward town was heavy with danger, but he rode steady, patient, and unbroken. The road to Moiti stretched out ahead, sun-scorched and dusty, every mile heavier than the last. Elias rode steady, one hand on the reins, the other tight on Clara's sleeve. She sat behind him, wrapped in his coat, silent and tense. Her green eyes scanned the horizon, alert to every movement, every shadow. Fear still clung to her like a second skin. Moiti wasn't welcoming. Not today. Not for her. Not for him. The first sign of trouble came before he even reached the outskirts. Men lined the porch of the saloon, boots spurred, hats tilted low, cigarettes dangling from sun-browned lips. Their eyes followed Elias like hawks, sharp and unyielding. He felt them, the way you feel a storm coming, and didn't flinch. He knew who they were. The sheriff appeared first, cautious, hands hovering near his belt. "Morning, Elias," he said carefully, as if testing the air. "Heard you took in a stranger." "She's not a stray dog," Elias replied flatly, voice calm but carrying weight. "She's hurt." The sheriff exhaled slowly. "Should have left her be. Her name's Clara. Belonged to a cattle broker named Roar. Paid good money." Elias's jaw tightened. "You don't pay for people." The street went still. Dust hung in the sun like smoke. Every eye turned toward them, and even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath. Then Roar himself emerged from the saloon, a man built to command and intimidate. Whiskey-scented and sneering, he stepped onto the wooden porch, eyes glittering with a mix of anger and surprise. "Well, now looks like the old rancher found his backbone," he said, voice thick with condescension. Elias didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need it yet. He just stared at the man, steady as stone. "You beat a woman," Elias said quietly, each word a weight. and you call it business. You come near my land again, and you'll find out what real work feels like." Roar laughed, low and cruel, the kind of laugh that made the dust crawl. But his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his whiskey glass. Confidence was a costume. He could wear it, but it didn't fit. Night fell, and the threats didn't stop. Roar hired 2 men from Sweetwater, doubling their pay, instructing them to make an accident out of Clara's return to the town. The air smelled of oil lamps and dry grass, a warning lingering in every shadow. Elias spent the day preparing. Each movement precise. He checked the locks, repaired fences, and made sure the horses were ready. Clara watched quietly, understanding that whatever came next, there would be no mercy for mistakes. The wind shifted as night fell, rolling down from the canyon in dry, sharp waves. It carried the smell of iron and dust, and with it, the sense of approaching danger. Clara sat by the fire, blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked. Elias nodded. He didn't answer yet. He could see the moon rising, fat and orange, casting long shadows over the open plains. He poured oil into lanterns, checked every door and window. Every hinge, every bolt, every splintered board mattered tonight. Out by the fence, 3 dark shapes appeared. No lanterns. No voices. Just the steady, heavy thud of hooves against dry earth. Elias held his breath. He didn't need speed. He didn't need to be young. He needed patience, and he had plenty of that. The first lantern flared. One of the men cursed loudly. "He's here," came a voice. Then shots rang out. Sharp. Clean. From the barn. Old Jake, Elias's ranch hand, had taken position hours ago. 20 years of working beside Elias had taught him timing and patience, and he fired with precision. Horses reared. The first man fell, screaming, dust and splinters flying around him. The others ducked behind the fence, panicked and blinded by the fire Elias had set in the haystack. Sparks shot upward, dancing like angry fireflies in the night. Inside the cabin, Clara crouched near the stairs. Her hands gripped the blanket, eyes wide. She could hear the voices outside, shouted commands and curses, the clatter of boots on the porch. But she also heard Elias's voice. Calm. Controlled. "You picked the wrong night," he said softly. The men fired back, more reckless shots ripping into the night. Every gunshot, every shout, moved them closer to the trap Elias had planned. He had rehearsed this in his mind for hours. Every step, every possible escape, every angle of attack. The fire, the barn, Jake's cover, it was all part of a single design. The first man tried to flank him, but Elias moved like a shadow. He lunged, knocking the man to the ground. The others scrambled, flailing, unable to think through the panic. The fire painted everything orange and red, turning the night into a chaotic, dangerous theater. By the time it was over, the men were fleeing. One dragged a companion, injured but alive. Smoke curled into the sky, mixing with dust and the scent of scorched wood. Dawn crept in slowly. The air was thick with ash and the memory of violence. The sheriff arrived, face hard, eyes narrowed. "Fire was an accident, right?" he asked. Elias nodded slowly. Clara emerged from the cabin, wrapped in the blanket, still pale but steady. She clutched a small knife in one hand, the other gripping the blanket, and followed him outside. "You could have died," she said, voice low but steady. "Not tonight," he replied. Her gaze swept over the smoldering barn. She shivered, but not from cold. "What will they do now?" Elias looked toward the hills where the men had vanished. "They'll come back." But next time, his voice trailed off. He didn't need to finish the sentence. She understood. They wouldn't be alone. That morning, he saddled the horses again. "Come," he said. "I need to show you something." The wind whispered over the plains, carrying a promise of change. Clara followed silently, curiosity and fear mixing in her chest. The journey was long, the sun rising higher with each mile, casting the land in gold. Finally, they stopped near the edge of a canyon. Peladuro stretched before them, red cliffs glowing in the sunlight, the river winding below like a silver ribbon. Elias dismounted first, offering his hand to help Clara down. His hands were rough, steady, kind. "This place saved me once," he said softly. "Maybe it will save you too." For a long moment, she didn't speak. She just stood at the rim, looking at the endless land, as if memorizing it so she could carry it with her when the world tried to take her again. Here, no one owned another soul. The earth didn't care about her past, the scars, or the marks left by cruel hands. Only the choices she made mattered. And for the first time, Clara felt the weight lift, even if just a fraction. The sun rose slow over Peladuro Canyon, spilling light across cliffs that glowed like molten gold. Clara stood at the edge of the ridge, wind tangling her hair, and felt the world stretch wide beneath her. For the first time in years, the horizon didn't feel like a threat. Elias stood beside her, steady and silent. His rough hands rested lightly on the reins of the horses, but his eyes never left hers. She could feel the weight of all that had happened, the terror, the pain, the men who had tried to take her, but in this moment, none of it mattered. "This place," she whispered, voice trembling with disbelief. "It feels alive." He nodded. "It is. The land doesn't care about your past. Only about what you decide to do with the life you've got now." For the first time, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, letting the air fill her lungs, letting the wind carry away the lingering fear. She realized she hadn't felt safe like this in as long as she could remember. And yet, even in safety, the memory of pain lingered. Elias turned to the river below, following the silver ribbon as it curved through the canyon floor. "We'll stay here for a while," he said quietly. "Morning, noon, night. Simple work. Simple meals. No one to hurt you. No one to take anything from you." Clara watched him move with a quiet efficiency that was almost meditative, tending the horses, arranging firewood, checking water from the creek. Each small action was precise, careful, deliberate. In a way, it reminded her that there were people in the world who could be steady, who could be trusted. People who didn't take advantage of weakness. Days bled into weeks. Morning brought chores with Elias, feeding the horses, tending to the small vegetable patch he'd planted near the cabin. Noon brought meager meals, shared quietly by the water's edge, the sun baking the canyon walls around them. Evening brought conversation, sometimes words, sometimes silence, as the fire crackled and shadows danced on the cabin walls. Clara learned to move without fear, to touch the land without dread, to feel the sun on her skin without flinching. Elias never pushed her, never asked her to speak of what had happened. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to tell him fragments, half-sentences, broken memories, whispers in the night. And he listened. One night, beneath a blanket of stars, she spoke fully for the first time. "I thought I was broken," she said softly, voice barely more than the whisper of wind through the canyon. Elias poked the fire with a stick, sending a small plume of sparks into the dark. "Maybe you were," he admitted, "but broken things still shine if you hold them up to the light." She laughed, the sound raw but genuine. It was a laugh that felt like healing. He smiled too, because in that moment, the canyon held them both safe, and the past could not reach them. Over the weeks, Clara's body healed. The bruises faded, the cuts closed, the fever that had held her hostage broke completely. Her legs grew strong enough to ride again, her hands sure enough to help Elias with the animals. And her voice, once small and trembling, began to assert itself, not with fear, but with quiet determination. But the shadow of the men from Moiti still lingered. Elias didn't ignore it. He rode the ridges, checked the boundaries, and made sure every approach was visible. Clara learned to watch the horizon with him, alert to movement, aware of danger but no longer paralyzed by it. She began to understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting despite it. One morning, as they rode along the ridge overlooking the canyon, she finally asked the question that had been gnawing at her. "Why did you save me?" Elias slowed the horse, letting her catch the rhythm of his voice. Because no one should be left to die for the sins of others. Because I've seen too much cruelty, too many people turning their heads, too many women afraid to breathe. And because someone had to stand up. She didn't speak for a moment, letting the words settle. She thought of all the times she had run, all the moments she had believed there was no one in the world who cared. And now, beside this man, on this ridge above a river that sparkled like silver, she could feel the weight lifting, piece by piece. That summer, they built a small cabin by the river, a shelter of rough-hewn wood and patched roof, simple but theirs. It was a home that required work, care, and attention, and in that effort, healing took root. They didn't need words for every small moment. They learned through actions, sharing meals, tending the animals, mending broken fences, and keeping each other alive through quiet acts of care. Clara began to trust again, cautiously, because trust had always been a dangerous gamble. She learned that it could be worth the risk when placed in the hands of someone who had chosen to fight for you. And Elias learned, perhaps, that helping someone else heal could remind him of his own humanity, the part of him that had almost been buried under years of survival and solitude. Time passed, marked by the sun and the seasons, and the canyon became their sanctuary. Word spread quietly about the little cabin in Peladuro. Travelers, lost or seeking refuge, would sometimes find a meal or a bed for the night. Clara and Elias never sought recognition. They only offered what they had, safety, food, and the unspoken promise that no one would be abandoned here. One crisp autumn evening, sitting outside the cabin, Clara turned to Elias. "Do you think what we did matters?" He gazed across the canyon, watching the river wind through red stone, the wind brushing the trees like a gentle whisper. "It always matters," he said. "Even the smallest act of courage or kindness echoes farther than we realize. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday, someone will remember." Clara leaned against him, finally allowing herself to feel at peace. She had survived cruelty, fear, and the kind of loneliness that gnaws at the soul. And now, in this place, she understood something powerful: survival was just the first step. Living, and choosing kindness, trust, and courage, was the next. The days flowed into months. They hunted, fished, and worked the land. Some nights, they would sit by the fire, listening to the canyon breathe. Clara would speak sometimes of dreams she'd once thought impossible. Elias would laugh quietly, a sound full of warmth and endurance. Years later, their little cabin became known as a haven. A place where no one turned away a soul in need. A place where kindness wasn't weakness, and courage didn't require fame. People whispered that it had changed the valley forever. Maybe it had. Clara looked at Elias one evening, the firelight painting his weathered face in gold. "If you hadn't stopped that day at the fence," she began. "I would have kept writing," he said softly. "But I would have regretted it every mile." She smiled, tears in her eyes, and the canyon seemed to hold its breath with them. This wasn't a story about bullets or cattle, nor about power or fear. It was about the choice to act when no one else would. About standing up for those who couldn't. About finding light in a world that often seemed determined to snuff it out. And sometimes, healing doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers. 3 times a day, in the small, steady acts that save a life, or a soul. Clara and Elias had learned to listen to that whisper, and in the silence of the canyon, it spoke loudly enough to change everything.